Sonic the Hedgehog versus Shadow the Hedgehog. When it comes to the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise, Sonic vs. Shadow is likely and will always be one of the most contentious debates in the series. Sonic and Shadow have one of the most iconic rivalry dynamics in gaming and are among the strongest characters in their universe. Beyond that, Sonic is almost always used as a measuring stick to compare Shadow to. On paper, Sonic vs. Shadow is a bit complicated to discuss in a video because both characters are growing stronger throughout the series. For that reason, an argument to say Sonic is stronger could be outdated by the time the next game takes place and vice versa. In many cases, people fail to keep that fact in mind and thus spawn some misconceptions. In order to showcase how much the power levels can shift, I want to highlight a few different games throughout this video. I want to do that before I give my thoughts on how the current iterations of the characters will compare to each other. Before getting started with that though, I'd like to ask if you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel, as I'd greatly appreciate it. But let's get started. Alright, with the bases covered, we can jump right into Sonic Adventure 2 and go on from there. This game is Shadow's debut appearance, and we can tell right from the jump that Shadow is meant to be a fighter that can compare with Sonic in both power and speed. The game's manual description for Sonic makes this immediately clear by pointing out that the fastest hedgehog on Earth now has competition. The Sonic the Hedgehog Encyclopedia also states that Shadow in-game shares all of Sonic's speed and acrobatics. Both of these statements are supported and backed up by all of their encounters throughout the game. When the two first meet, Sonic charges at Shadow after he realizes the military mixed up the two, and Shadow reacts to this and uses Chaos Control to warp to Sonic and dash past him. Sonic is initially impressed with what appeared to be Shadow's speed, however he quickly realized that Shadow had actually used teleportation instead of just his raw speed. Fast forward to their second encounter in the Green Forest, where the two actually have a proper fight. While the gameplay can make this battle appear to be one-sided, depending on which story you're playing, the cutscenes that follow in both stories suggest that the two were relative. Neither hedgehog has an advantage over the other, and both are shown taking breaths. This battle cut short here, but we get their final battle right outside of the space colony arc. Shadow's objective at this point is to outright kill Sonic, while Sonic's objective is to destroy the Eclipse Cannon. Shadow was effectively bloodlusted in this battle, but he seems to have come up short of actually beating Sonic, as the cutscene following this fight in the hero story shows that Sonic succeeds in his mission. By the time this battle finally comes around, Sonic had learned the Chaos Control with a fake Chaos Emerald, meaning the one advantage that Shadow had over him was neutralized. So ultimately this would come down to whoever was the better fighter, and that appears to be Sonic. Something interesting to note is that when Sonic uses Chaos Control with the fake Emerald, the first time he appears right in front of Knuckles and he seems to be drained from performing this feat. Not only is Sonic shown laying on the ground basically unconscious for a few seconds, but he then starts making awkward movements that causes Knuckles to check in on him and ask if he's okay. Depending on how much you think this may have impacted Sonic's performance in fights after this could help further prove Sonic's superiority over Shadow in this game. The Prima Games guide for Sonic Adventure 2 also provides some statements in Sonic's favor as well when describing their final battle. The description for the hero story tells us that Shadow has been underestimating Sonic and that his bark is worse than his bite. It then goes on to say that with this tough talk, you'd expect Shadow to be a real threat, but he's not, and the guide attributes that to Shadow having mostly the same moveset as Sonic. The dark story description for Sonic is extremely tame in comparison and tells us that Sonic is wily but Shadow is shiftier. To be wily is to be skilled at gaining an advantage, especially through deceitful means, and to be shifty is to appear deceitful or evasive. Sonic's wiliness in this context is likely in reference to his combat skill, so you could interpret this to be saying that Shadow is specifically more skilled at deceiving deceitful combat tactics than Sonic. You could say this is claiming that Shadow is more skilled than Sonic in general, but that wouldn't really make sense because that would directly conflict with Shadow's description saying he's not a real threat to Sonic. Since their physical stats were relative and they basically have the same moveset, their individual skills as fighter would be the main factor in determining a victor, obviously. Ultimately, with all facts considered, we know Shadow can offer a decent fight, but Sonic is his superior when push comes to shove. In the case of Sonic Adventure 2, Sonic mainly has the edge due to combat skill, but things shift heavily into Shadow's favor during the events of Shadow the Hedgehog. If you know anything about the game, then this shouldn't be too much of a surprise. Shadow uses guns, Sonic doesn't, so I think it's clear who the superior fighter is. It's even stated that nothing gets in Shadow's way when he wields a gun, so Sonic doesn't really stand a chance here. No, but jokes aside, unlike most other Sonic titles, this game has multiple endings and hundreds of different gameplay sequences based on how you play the game. These endings and sequences based on if you choose to follow the dark, hero, or neutral routes for different missions throughout the game. The dark route choices usually involve helping the Black Arms in their invasion of Earth and helping Eggman with his own schemes. The hero route normally involves helping Gun, Sonic, and his friends fight back against the alien invaders, and the neutral route has Shadow basically ignore both sides and do his own thing by collecting the Chaos Emeralds for himself. The manual for this game reinforces the notion that Shadow is a rival to Sonic in speed, but still declares that Sonic is the fastest supersonic hedgehog and that his speed is second to none, meaning that he should be a little bit faster at the very least. Shadow the Hedgehog has 10 endings based on the 5 routes you can follow throughout your gameplay, which all need to be beaten in order to unlock the true ending. The 5 routes are the true dark route, the neutral route, the hero route, and the true hero route. And for each route, there's a hero mission and dark missions that determines which boss you fight. Of the main 10 endings, there are 3 that have Shadow face off against Sonic and a mech known as Diabolon. Shadow's moves can vary depending on the route, but in all 3 scenarios, Shadow is able to beat Sonic and the Diabolon at the same time. You could try and dismiss this by saying Sonic could be holding back, which may be true, but Sonic eventually makes a statement talking about how playtime is over in the middle of the fight, which would suggest he wouldn't hold back from that point onward. The remaining 7 points aren't too important for this discussion, and while the true ending doesn't explicitly follow any of the routes, I think it should be some variant of the dark route or true hero route, since those are the only routes in the game where Shadow ends up on the Black Comet to collect the last Chaos Emerald. This is important because the last story, which covers the true ending, has Shadow on the Black Comet collecting the last Chaos Emerald as well. If Shadow were to make a choice in favor of the dark mission for either of those 2 endings, he fights and defeats Sonic and Diabolon. It's also important to note the big difference in most of these endings is the morality Shadow develops as you make your choices playing through the game, not Shadow being wildly stronger or weaker. While Shadow does get stronger throughout the game, it's not like he's receiving crazy training or special amps in one route that he doesn't get in another. Beyond the clear power advantage Shadow has at this point, he does develop his powers to the point that he can use the Hero Shadow and Dark Shadow forms, and he introduces a new Chaos ability in the Dark Shadow form with Chaos Blast. Both of these forms grant Shadow temporary invincibility, and he can activate these forms multiple times in a fight, so the gap between Shadow and Sonic grows that much higher when considering those forms. While Shadow may be a bit slower, we know he can beat Sonic regardless at this point in time. I'll skip past some games to talk about Sonic 06, because this is where I think the strength difference between the 2 hedgehogs is at its peak. There is also a particular misconception from this game that I plan on addressing later. Most people would argue Shadow is stronger because he scales to Mephiles the Dark, who could one-shot Sonic in this game, but this is ignoring a very explicit detail that Mephiles made sure Sonic was off guard before attacking him and had ducked a direct confrontation with Sonic throughout the whole game. Like in most verses, even the strongest characters in the Sonic franchise can be vulnerable to characters far weaker than them if they're caught off guard. We've literally seen Sonic get one shot out of his super form because base Knuckles caught him off guard in Sonic 3. So this shouldn't be too much of a surprise. This off guard feat aside, there's a lot to imply Sonic's superiority to Shadow in 06 when it comes to both strength and speed. Sonic and Shadow both have fights with Silver the Hedgehog, which can be used to directly compare the two. The gameplay on its own isn't very helpful, but we can gather from the cutscenes that follow that Sonic had a clear advantage over Silver, while Shadow was stalemating him before using Chaos Control. While Silver does turn the tables on Sonic a few moments later, this is after Sonic let his guard down because he tries to talk to Silver about why he's attacking him. The Prima Guide suggests that the main difference in both battles was speed. The description for Sonic vs. Silver from Silver's perspective states that everybody knows Sonic is the fastest thing on two legs, and that while Silver wants to destroy Sonic, at the moment he'd settle for just simply slowing him down. The description for Shadow vs. Silver outright states that Shadow isn't nearly as fast as Sonic. Using these along with the statement saying Sonic is either the fastest being on two legs or that he's the world's fastest hedgehog, Sonic is clearly faster than Shadow, and this time it's not close. You could be a bit skeptical and question if Shadow used his Chaos Boost powers that his moveset features in this game, which is his full power, but I'd argue he probably did. Mephiles on his own is considered to be so strong that Shadow needs to use his Chaos powers to defeat him, and Mephiles thought it was better to try having Silver kill Sonic than confront him personally. I don't think it would make any sense to leave or have Silver do this if he didn't have equal or better chances of defeating Sonic than Mephiles did. Even if you disregard that though, Sonic is still considered faster than Shadow by the Prima Guide despite the fact that he has these abilities. The implication for Sonic being way stronger are very obvious and explicit in the last story of 06, where all the main cast do everything they can to revive Sonic because they all need his power to defeat Solaris. Shadow himself doesn't consider beating Solaris to be a possibility to even consider if Sonic is not alive. The Prima Guide once again gives us some insight on this and confirms that Sonic is the only one with the power and strength to, and I quote, defeat the fires and banish the living flame forever. Sonic and Shadow fight Solaris in their super forms, which should give both of them equal amps because it's literally just the same form. On top of this, Shadow has other ways to amp himself with Chaos Boost and by taking off his inhibitor rings, but he's still considered Sonic's inferior by a guide in his own personal opinion. In the events of 06, Sonic's easily taking the W here. I guess that was a fairly long-winded way about trying to make a point, but I think by now you get the point I'm trying to make with how these two can fluctuate when it comes to their stats. This of course happens in other games too, but in a lot of cases they mainly focus on comparing their speed, while the difference in their strength is ambiguous, and it should go without saying that the most recent feats would be the most relevant. The most recent game that we can use to compare the two is Sonic Forces by gauging how the two Hedgehog compare to Infinite. Before his rebirth, Infinite gets absolutely embarrassed by Shadow, but comes to view him as his inferior after merging with the Phantom Ruby prototype. After talking down on Shadow in their reunion, he flexes the fact that Sonic wouldn't be able to stop him with his new unrivaled strength and leave Shadow. In the manual for Forces, it stated that there was no one left to stop Eggman's takeover of the planet after Sonic was defeated by Infinite. So with that context in mind, and Infinite's fixation on strength because of Shadow, I think bringing up Sonic the way he did is meant to imply that Sonic is stronger than Shadow. Sonic is a similar portrayal as he did in 06, where the main cast can't defeat the big bad without him. For the most part of the story, Sonic's friends and their allies struggle to make any progress when defeating Eggman before Sonic is freed from the Death Egg. It should also be noted that Eggman specifically wanted to remove Sonic out of the picture before his takeover and doesn't express any concerns for Shadow at any point in time. Even when Infinite defeated Sonic the second time, Eggman considered it very concerning that Infinite allowed him to survive even though they've let the rest of Sonic's friends survive for months. While there's some other minor points here and there, I think the last major point that supports this is the fact that Sonic claims to be in a class all his own in response to Infinite saying he'll show Sonic how outclassed he is. Sonic had not seen Infinite at his full strength at this point, but he should be aware of how powerful his allies are, which would include Shadow. Some like to argue that Shadow is stronger in forces because they think that Sonic cowered before a clone of Shadow that's equal to the original Shadow, which is just a blatant misinterpretation of what happens. Sonic confronts the clone because he didn't know this was a clone at the time and wanted to figure out why Shadow was working under Eggman. Instead of getting any help, Sonic confronts this alone, which would imply his confidence in taking down Shadow if anything. The clone doesn't talk and instead chooses to launch a kick at Sonic, which Sonic reacts to and puts his hands up to block. The real Shadow then stops time, knocks out his clone with a kick, and then explains some information to Sonic. This isn't a scene of Sonic being pressed, he's simply trying to block an attack. This is the most recent time they can easily be compared in the games, and we probably won't get much more information till Shadow gets a relevant role in a future game. After Sonic 06, a lot of games tend to focus on Sonic and his development and leave out most of the cast. This leaves many instances in the timeline where Sonic gets a string of really good feats that Shadow may not get any scaling to until many games down the line. Sonic Frontiers is a really good and recent example of this, since the game has Super Sonic take on a Titan known as Giganto. When talking about how strong this Titan is, the director for Frontiers tells us that we should imagine it being as powerful as all the previous final bosses Super Sonic had fought before. Despite being that strong, Giganto can't even damage the current Super Sonic, which should showcase how strong Sonic really is by Sonic Frontiers. At this point in the video, I want to address a few misconceptions surrounding the topic that have been quite prominent from what I've been able to gather. This first one and popular Shadow argument is that since Sonic and Shadow are often relative base to base, Shadow would beat him more often than not due to his array of chaos abilities. The logic itself isn't bad or anything. In fact, I think it's a fairly reasonable conclusion, but my issue with this is that Shadow does not utilize his chaos abilities to the most lethal extent in character. Shadow can slow down time around his opponents, freeze them in time completely, or attack using spatial distortions, but these are rarely used in any crazy extent in a fight. In theory, Shadow should be able to freeze time and brutalize Sonic while he's immobile and take the W from there, but the only chaos ability he's ever spammed consistently in a fight is his teleportation. If Shadow really wanted to, he could have used a crazy lethal strategy to fight Sonic in Adventure 2, where we know he wanted to kill Sonic, but he doesn't. It's also important to note that Sonic has gone even with or beaten Shadow despite these abilities, and that Sonic has his own abilities that can be just as, if not more deadly than Shadow's. Sonic can manipulate time, even without chaos control, with the ability aptly named Time Stop. He can slow time down with Time Break, and has other weird abilities like Ring Time, which lets Sonic turn enemies into rings, which Shadow has absolutely no way to counter that we know of. Sonic doesn't use a lot of abilities beyond their debut game, but if you were to grant Shadow a win condition by assuming he'll immediately use the most broken abilities in the most lethal way possible, then you should also consider that you could do the same exact thing for Sonic. The next point kind of ties back to the previous one, but there's enough of a distinction made where I think it'd be fine if I separated them. Another common point made in the favor of Shadow is that if he's relative to Sonic stat-wise, then he could always take off his inhibitor rings and take down Sonic with a power-up greater than 2 Chaos Emerald boost. This goes back to 06, where Shadow took off his rings to destroy Mephiles and his army of clones that he made in their final encounter. People argue this boost is greater than the boost of 2 Chaos Emeralds would grant because Mephiles is shown waving around 2 emeralds as he creates his clones. The Prima Guide contradicts this idea completely, as it tells us that Mephiles created the clones with his own power. Going off the scaling I mentioned earlier, Sonic is still considered stronger and faster than Shadow in this same game, despite potential inhibitor ring amps. You can also argue that Shadow had only used this once canonically, so he wouldn't be inclined to do it again even if it was against Sonic. You could dismiss the one-time appearance arguments by pointing out that some things would be added or removed to better the match for the gameplay vision for certain games, but this only serves as an explanation on a meta level. In-universe, the lack of usage is still canonical and would need a reasonable in-universe explanation regardless of the meta reason. Aside from the in-character argument I've been making, you could also maybe say that some abilities may no longer be accessible for one reason or another, but at that point those abilities aren't even relevant beyond the game they appear in. In either scenario, Sonic gets an added advantage of sharing a similar moveset to Shadow. If they use the same moves in a fight and are relative in physical stats, then Sonic's skill should give him the win like it did in Sonic Adventure 2. For the last part of this video, I want to quickly talk about the handful of forms both characters have and compare them to each other. Aside from his super form, Shadow's forms are mostly useless here. The Hero and Dark Hero forms only appear in Shadow the Hedgehog, while the Chaos boost only exists in 06, and Base Sonic by the time of 06 and beyond would have long surpassed all of them. The only route you could take at this point is to compare Super Shadow to all of Sonic's forms, but the results are pretty obvious. Sonic's Werehog form would get destroyed since it's a form Sonic achieves by absorbing a small fraction of Dark Gaia's energy, while Super Sonic in Sonic Unleashed could take on a full power Dark Gaia. Shadow is considered comparable to Sonic in Sonic Colors DS, which happens after Unleashed, so Shadow should have similar scaling with his super form. Excalibur Sonic is very hard to quantify, though I will say the best argument you could make for it is to take this statement saying that there's nothing Excalibur can't cut through and apply the most literal of interpretations to it. This is an obvious hyperbole and could be dismissed on those grounds, and you could also question how reliable the statement is even if you did take it literally, since it comes from Excalibur itself and Excalibur wouldn't know anything outside of Camelot. If you've seen my previous Sonic and Shadow videos, then you'll probably guess that Darkspine Sonic doesn't stand much of a chance here either. His best scaling is just low multiversal with no extra speed scaling beyond Sonic's base, while Super Shadow is reaching the 5D levels of power with immeasurable speed. I've gone through the 5D superform argument enough times, so I'm not going to touch up on it here. If you want a refresher, then check out one of my previous Sonic videos. Lastly, we have Super Sonic and Hypersonic, and like I said, the winner here is obvious. The winner of Super Sonic versus Super Shadow will depend on the differences in their bases, and as I went over, Sonic has the edge over Shadow in terms of stats, meaning he'd likely win Superform versus Superform, and I'm sure everyone can agree that Hypersonic defeats Super Shadow.